Front fork service is not something that's typically mentioned in the owner's or service manuals for most small scooters. Larger bikes may specify high mileages, like 10,000 to 50,000 miles, and many only recommend low mileage fork oil changes for sport bikes that are ridden aggressively. Generally being considered low mileage and low powered vehicles may be why it's hard to find much info related to small scooters. Checking for leaks or general condition periodically is the one thing that many manuals do advise. This is simple enough. Look at the dust seals that cover the area between the fork leg and the fork tubes and see if they have any cracking or damage. They'll need to be replaced if they do. Look all around the fork for any signs of leaks. Check the fork tubes to see if they're oily. If so, the fork seals are bad. Also check around the bottom of the fork where there's a bolt to make sure nothing is leaking. Any leaks around the forks are dangerous because they are so close to the front brake and tire. You could also put weight on the forks to make sure they don't bottom out easily or struggle to return. If they do either of these things, plan to do a service or you could opt to replace them. Beyond those quick checks, most scooter forks probably won't require much attention, but some recommend changing fork oil and seals every 2 to 4 years on any machine that has oil-filled forks. The pair that I'll be working on today are 14 years old, haven't been apart for at least 9 years, and are clearly showing signs that they need some attention, like these badly cracked dust seals. Everything was working fine for me without leaks, but I thought it was about time to do a basic service and replace the fork seals and oil as well, so let's get started. You don't need to take the entire steering stem and fork assembly off, but mine was off as part of a larger project. In most cases, you just need to remove the front wheel, brakes, and fender before the forks can be removed. Loosen the cap on top of the fork that you're removing. It doesn't always have to be removed, depending on the design of the steering stem and fork, but it's easier to break loose when it's secured in the stem. Once it moves a few turns, stop. Now loosen the bolt or bolts in the steering stem that clamp to secure the fork until there's a small gap between the bolt head and the stem so you know it's not putting pressure on the fork anymore. With some scooters, you'll be able to slide the fork out now. With others, like mine, the cap has to come off first. The cap has a spring under it, so hold pressure down on the cap while you are loosening it to prevent it from popping off. If you're doing this on the scooter, try to keep one hand on the fork to keep it from falling when the cap is removed, or have someone else hold the fork. Slide the fork out of the steering stem and keep it upright so no fluid spills and nothing falls out. I like to secure the fork upright in a vise, protected with rags or soft jaws, but you can hold it or find some other way to keep it upright while you work. If you use a vise, try to clamp to a solid section like where the axle goes, and don't apply too much force. Lay out some rags or paper towels, or something else that is clean and absorbent and you don't mind getting oil and chemicals on. It's also a good idea to put on rubber gloves now if you aren't already wearing them. You should see a spring inside of the fork tube. Pull it out slowly so most of the oil on it can drain off back into the fork. If you have progressive rate springs, where coils on one end are closer together than on the other, note the orientation of the spring so you can put it back in the same way and then set it aside. Most guides will direct you to drain the fork oil now, but I like to check fork oil height at this point. Many scooters from the big brands may have thorough specs listed for fork oil height and/or volume, but this is not often the case when dealing with Chinese scooters like the one I'm working on. For that reason, I check what the forks have in them rather than just dumping the oil out, as long as the forks that I'm servicing were working well when removed. If you have specs from the manufacturer, you can skip this part. The first check is fork oil height, and it needs to be done with the fork sitting straight up and compressed. To compress the fork, push down on the stanchion tube slowly until it stops. Now you'll need a way to measure the distance from the top of the fork tube to the top of the oil inside. You can use a tape measure or other methods, but I used a digital caliper. I placed the caliper flat on top of the fork tube and then extended it down until it just touched the top of the oil. Once I had that measurement, I tried a couple of more times to make sure it was correct and then wrote it down. I like to see oil only on the very end of the measuring device so I know it's right at the edge of the fluid since it's difficult to get a clear visual. That measurement is the fork oil height. I also want to know the volume of oil, so I use a graduated container when I drain the oil. Turn the fork upside down over the container, and once it stops draining quickly, pump the fork tube in and out to work out as much of the remaining oil as you can. Note the volume of oil drained as well. Now remove the dust seal. Some come off by hand as shown, and others may need to be gently pried up with a flat screwdriver. Next, we'll try to separate the fork tube from the fork leg. Begin by putting the leg in a vise so you can see the bottom of the leg. You should see a bolt with a socket head that accepts an Allen wrench. In my case, it uses an 8mm hex key. It's unlikely that you'll be able to remove this bolt now, but try to turn it to break it free. Sometimes they're stubborn, like in this case where I had to give it a few taps with a brass hammer to get the bolt turning. If it's really stuck, you can try heating the area near the bolt with a heat gun first, but be sure to wear heat-resistant gloves if you do. Unless you get lucky and the bolt comes out, you'll probably need to take more steps. Look down inside of the fork tube and you should be able to see the top of the damper rod. Many have a socket for an Allen key in that as well. I had a hard time getting a shot of it installed, so this is what it looks like uninstalled. If you see that, find a hex key that fits, again an 8mm in my case. You will probably need to use a socket type Allen key and an extension because other styles just won't reach. Now you can hold the damper rod at each end, and the bolt along with the washer should be able to be removed from the bottom of the fork leg. If yours doesn't have the spot for the Allen key, or you don't have the tools around to reach it, you can try putting the spring back in and the cap back on the fork tube to see if that will put enough pressure on the damper to hold it while you remove the bolt. Once the bolt is removed, you should be able to slide out the fork tube. Then carefully dump the damper rod and any other parts out through the top of the fork tube. Pay close attention to how the parts come out so you can put them back in the correct order later. Now it's time to take the fork seal out. You should see a retainer clip above the seal. If it looks like the one shown, use a flat screwdriver to gently pry it out, trying not to deform it. If yours has a snap ring, then use snap ring pliers instead. I use a seal puller most of the time, but you can even use a wrench to pull the seal. At this point, the fork is pretty well disassembled, but before you clean using any harsh chemicals, you should also remove the O-ring from the fork cap. This can be done with a small screwdriver or pick. Be very careful if you plan to reuse the O-ring. Now all parts can be cleaned. I use brake parts cleaner, but some use isopropyl alcohol or even soap and water. If you use chemicals, be careful around any painted surfaces because some chemicals will damage paint. My forks will be stripped and painted before reassembly, so I wasn't concerned. After everything is clean and dry, inspect the parts for any damage and check the threads of bolts for the fork and steering stem as well as threaded holes. With everything this far apart, I would recommend replacing the fork seals, dust seals, and the O-rings in the fork cap. Popular name brand scooters usually have parts available from a dealer, but replacement parts can be more difficult to find for Chinese scooters. The fork seals should have 3 numbers on them that indicate their size, so you can get replacements that way. For example, mine say 26, 37, and 10.5. That means the seals are 26mm inside diameter, 37mm outside diameter, and 10.5mm thick. Dust seals probably won't have any helpful info on them, so you'll need to take a couple of measurements. Measure the diameter of the fork tube. Then measure the diameter of the top section of the fork leg where the dust seal sits. You can use those two numbers to find suitable seals, but it may take a little effort. My fork tubes measured 26 millimeters and the top of the legs were just over 45 millimeters, and I ended up getting a dust seal kit part number 57-133 from All Balls Racing. The O-rings for the fork caps were matched up at a local hardware store. Now it's time to start getting the fork back together, beginning with installing the fork seal. Apply grease to the inner surface of the seal, or just use a little fork oil, and begin to push the seal into place by hand with the numbers facing outward. Now use a seal driver, socket, or a pipe of an appropriate diameter to drive the seal in. Make sure whatever you use doesn't have sharp edges that can damage the seal. Once all of the seal is below the retaining clip groove, it should be in far enough. Install the retaining clip by pushing one side into the groove and working your way around. Then double check that it's sitting in the groove all the way around. Lubricate the fork tube with a little bit of fork oil, and then slide it into the leg so the top where the cap goes is facing up. Drop the damper, spring, and any other parts that your fork may use down into the tube just as they came out. Put the washer over the bolt for the bottom of the fork and apply a few drops of medium-strength thread locker. Use an Allen key and an extension, or whatever method you use during removal, to apply pressure to the damper rod and then start the bolt. Then tighten the bolt while holding the damper. Next, install the dust seal. Usually this will slide on by hand pretty easily. In my case, the aftermarket seals were a bit tight, so I used a heat gun to make them more pliable before installation. Be careful not to overheat and melt your seals if you try this. Now it's time to put in the fork oil. If you don't have a manufacturer recommendation, you may want to stick with a medium viscosity fork oil, around 10 weight. You can use a lighter or heavier oil if you want to see if it makes the suspension better for you. Sometimes lighter riders like to use thinner oils such as 5 weight, and heavy riders try thicker oils like 20 weight. If you have a manufacturer specification of fork oil volume, measure out that amount of oil and pour it in, and that's all you need to do. Otherwise, use the amount that you measured when draining the forks to decide how much oil to use. I drained 50 milliliters, so I poured 60 milliliters of oil in because I wanted to use slightly more oil to make setting the oil height easy. Pump the fork tube up and down a few times to work out any air that may be trapped. Next, I'm going to set the fork oil height. Again, if you have a manufacturer specified volume, you can skip this part. You can buy or make a fork oil height setting tool. It's basically a plate that sits on top of the fork tube with a small tube going through it that can be locked into place with a set screw. A syringe attaches to one end of the tube to allow oil to be drawn out. I made my own using a piece of 1/8" steel with a drill stop welded to it to hold a piece of 1/4" brass tubing. Some use a washer instead of the steel plate, and the drill stop doesn't really have to be welded on. It can just sit on top of the plate. You'll need to know a fork oil height to set your tool to. I used 99 millimeters for mine, just 0.3 millimeters higher than what I measured before draining the oil, because I know a small amount of oil was lost when the spring was removed. If you have a manufacturer specification, use that for the height. Set the distance from the bottom of the tube to the bottom of the plate at this measurement, and then lock the tube into place with the set screw. Double check the measurement to be sure that nothing moved while tightening. Set your fork straight up with it collapsed so the tube is all the way down, and place the tool into the fork. Hold the plate on top of the fork while using the syringe to suck oil out. Once it won't draw out any more oil, the height is set and you can remove the tool. Leave the tool exactly as it is, and when it's time to do the second fork, you can be sure that you'll get the same height. Pull the fork tube up and slide the fork spring into the fork, being sure to install it in the same orientation that it was originally in. Find your fork cap and O-ring. Use a little fork oil to lube the O-ring and then slide it over the cap and into its groove carefully by hand. If your fork slides into the steering stem with the cap in place, then you can install the cap now and tighten the fork into the stem. Otherwise, slide the fork tube into the steering stem, making sure it's on the proper side and keeping it as upright as possible so no oil will spill. Then hold the fork while pushing down on the cap and turning it to get it started into the tube. You can also hold the cap down while turning the fork tube if that's easier. Tighten the cap, and then tighten the bolt or bolts in the steering stem to clamp the fork into the stem. You may want to compress the fork to be sure it can be compressed and returns as it should, and to make sure it's not too soft or bottoms out easily. If it does, you may have the wrong fork oil height or volume, or you could have a mechanical issue that will need to be repaired. At this point you should be finished with one fork, so just repeat the process for the other. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe for more if you found this video helpful.